Griffith seem to have been really hitting a couple of home runs just this last couple of weeks. Firstly, they opened a new Pathways home in Brisbane, so it's on Ann Street. So from memory, Griffith College, which is obviously operated by Navitas as a partner, and the English Language Institute will move into that space. It just looked like a fabulous facility, and bringing all of those things together, I think, is a really, really good thing. So congratulations to Griffith on that one. Hi, I'm Dirk Mulder, founder of the Koala News, and I'm coming to you from Durrag Country, west of Sydney.
And g'day, I'm Rob Malicki. I forgot my job. I'm the CEO of the Global Society, coming today from Whadjuk Noongar Country, on the opposite side of the country in Perth, in Western Australia. Something feels odd, Dirk. I can't quite work out what it is.
I could probably guess. You're in Perth and I'm in Sydney.
I know. It's like we can't organise to be in the same place at the same time.
We cannot.
Although we did. we were just at AIEC a couple of weeks ago. Really good. And yeah, back into the swing of things. Everyone's burrowing down and still quite a lot going on. Of course, we're still waiting for the news about whether or not this legislation is going to pass Parliament in regards to international student caps.
That's right.
In the interim, of course, work's got to be progressing, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It's BAU. There's lots going on. You wouldn't want to be in an institution at the moment, would you? I mean, it's really, really difficult to be able to keep moving forward while at the same time anticipating a tidal wave coming over your head fairly shortly. As you mentioned, 18th of November is when the legislation is due to be debated by the Senate on the Senate floor. I say due because it was also due at the last sitting and it never quite got there. I think we'll all be looking at the order of business for the 18th very, very closely and to see whether it actually makes it onto the floor, and if so, what debate happens and what may come from it.
And maybe it's a good moment for us to sort of go into what institutions are starting to do in terms of getting themselves organised. There was an email from Mark Scott, the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Sydney, that went out to staff recently. You want to tell us a little bit about that? Because I reckon that's probably indicative of a lot of the conversations going on out in organisations right now.
Yeah, look, absolutely. Probably before I even get to Mark Scott, I mean, we know that the ACU has written to their education agents based upon the proposed cap limits that they've been given for next year and them essentially already being full. We know UNSW did that, I think, probably a week and a half, 2 weeks ago. So we're certainly seeing a lot of movement within that space. You referenced Mark Scott's email, and it's a really interesting and important one. So Mark Scott, obviously Vice-Chancellor at the University of Sydney. University of Sydney's come under a lot of scrutiny as being, I guess, the institution, which has been the Rivers of Gold institution, for the want of a better word. I think Professor Scott at the Senate hearings handled himself very, very well and spoke about the University of Sydney certainly being at the top end of town and solving some of the larger research issues, and that takes money. So he wrote to staff, and it was a really interesting viewpoint because if you remember back to the Senate hearings, there was a lot of discussion about the data and whether the data was accurate and the consultation process that went between the department and institutions.
And spoiler alert, shock horror.
Shock horror.
Shock horror.
Shock
it
horror.
Was accurate.
It wasn't necessarily right. Look, from my recollection, I say my recollection because I thought I'd actually published a note on this, and I went back while I was writing this story on this email, and I actually didn't write a note on it. But from my recollection, the department undertook to the Senate committee that they would follow up with each and every institution that had come back to say that their data didn't quite match. Obviously, the University of Sydney was one of those. In Scott's email, I'll just read you this paragraph because I think this one's really, really important, or actually maybe two paragraphs. The department's published estimate of 17,247 new international student commences in 2024 overstated our actual new overseas student commencements by more than 3,000 students. In fact, in 2024, we expect to have enrolled about 14,050 students, as defined by the department, up from 12,790 in 2023. The department's estimate incorrectly indicated a year-on-year growth rate of 35% in 2024 compared to an actual growth rate of less than 10%. The widespread use of these incorrect estimates means that public debate about the growth of our international student cohort has given a misleading picture of our actual enrolment growth this year. The cap legislation is expected to come before the Senate, etc., etc. It's a really interesting point. I guess he's really managing expectations there, and this narrative that the top end of town have been growing exponentially for years and years and years. Now, actually, I think Scott's calling that out, which is a good thing. Yeah, it's an interesting one, Rob. It really is.
It's a bit of a worry, isn't it, when statistics from a major institution that are being used to make enormous decisions that are going to impact not only that particular institution, but society as a whole, out by, off the top of my head, 22%.
Yeah.
It's a little bit shameful, really.
Well, yeah, and so I think, I mean, this is politics with a capital P, right? So the government
Absolutely.
obviously wants a narrative that makes it look like institutions have been, overindulging in international student recruitment. They've gone out to the public, and they know that the Senate was going to call in these figures, and they were made public. So they're the figures that are on record. They've obviously had a meeting. I think they've come to some sort of reasonable conclusion that they were overestimated, but they haven't been released publicly, or they haven't been updated publicly, or there's been
Mm.
no sort of narrative in the public view that the University of Sydney's numbers have changed significantly. So again, from Scott's perspective, I think he's done the right thing in calling that out. I think we're doing the right thing in shining a light on that. Whether the larger broadsheets will continue to do that, or whether they will continue to push the government narrative and talk about these universities overindulging and losing social license, etc., we'll see. But look, 10%. I mean, look, everyone's view is going to be different, and that's what makes this sort of somewhat hard to manage. But a 10% growth rate, particularly a year and a bit over past COVID, probably isn't unrealistic and isn't outside the bounds of some sort of normal acceptable rate.
And I think for any organisation, any business in that sense, if you're growing at 10%, that's manageable growth. You can adapt your systems and processes and staffing and the like to actually manage that kind of growth. So this rhetoric that things are running out of control and there are just floods of students coming into places that institutions, organisations are unable to manage is just a bit of a furphy. Yeah.
And I think you just nailed it with that managed growth, right? Because that is literally the mantra of the government. Manage sustainable growth over the future. So again, as you say, there's been hyperbole around that growth. It does seem to be more managed growth now. Obviously, across the sector, we've seen a larger than normal increase on the back of COVID with pent-up interest or pent-up demand. But certainly from the University of Sydney's case, I think they're right in readjusting this.
By the time you and I talk next in a couple of weeks, we will be beyond the 18th of November. So it'll be interesting to be on that conversation, listening in and chatting about how that's actually unfolded. I really can't wait to see what happens in the next couple of weeks. And actually, before we move on from that, I had an interesting conversation with Melissa Banks at the AIEC conference. I just put that podcast out last week. And I love Melissa's perspective on things. I've learned so much from her over the years, but as somebody who's so experienced in international education, the sort of flip side of this coin really is us looking to the future about how we are going to change the narrative around international education and how we can use this whole thing as an opportunity to adjust the way we do things. I'd really recommend everyone to go back and have a listen to that episode with Melissa Banks. It's the last one in your podcast feed if you're listening to this news episode, because she's got a beautiful way of looking at this kind of current crisis that's embroiled the industry.
And what a person to do it. I mean, most recently the head of Austrade Education, some fantastic experience and perspective there to bring to the table around a conversation like this.
It's just so good to have that kind of person around, so wise, has seen all of the bumps along the road. And it was just, there were things that came out of that conversation where I was just like, you're spot on. So go back and listen to that one. Of course, when we talk about the impact of this potential legislation, because it hasn't passed on Australia, it's not just Australia. I mean, this is also going to impact student flows around the world. And of course, hot off the press this morning, you've just published an article which is sort of looking at how this is impacting global student flows. Do you want to tell me a bit about that?
Yes, absolutely. So while I published it, Tracy Harris wrote it, and I don't want to steal her thunder, but she was part of a session at AIEC with John Shue of Navitas and Simon Emmett of IDP Connect, and it was all about policy headwinds and I guess their effects on different parts of the world. And I won't go into too much about it because I think the article's a good read, but the headline I think is really, really important. We know that obviously the UK, Canada, the US and us are all experiencing different machinations at the moment, probably less so the US, but obviously we're recording today Wednesday, which is election day in the United States. So it'll be interesting to see what impact may come from that. But with saying that, the headline of this is the changing demand for first destination choice or first choice destination. There's a big graph right at the top of it where Australia is down 1%, the United States is up 4%, the UK is down 1%, but the kicker is that Canada and everything that's been going on in Canada is down 9%. New Zealand's up and other destinations are up as well, fairly decently. But the Canadian experience is really one. So Canada, my understanding, was in the last emerging futures set of data. Canada was the first choice destination. They've now lost that place. So it speaks very, very significantly to what policy changes do to demand from the student. And if, again, I mean, we've spoken about it a number of times, but if this keeps going, then we can probably anticipate to see that 1% decline for Australia as a first choice destination continue to slip, and looking at other destinations picking that up. I mean, one of the other big one I probably should mention is that other destinations are up 6%. So, we've been talking now for, I don't know, probably the last 6 or so months about, the rise of Germany and some of those other destinations, and they're now starting to come through in some fairly tangible statistics.
Yeah, I'm definitely hearing that as I'm talking to people around the industry as well. This kind of increase in numbers around to other destinations. And we can see that's very much the canary in the coal mine, isn't it?
Sure.
Having Canada, 12 months in front of us, I suppose you'd say?
Yeah.
Seeing what that's doing. And maybe the Canadian government would say, well, that was the intention of their policy, was actually to wind things back, as the Australian government would probably say here. The thing is, going backwards at 10% a year has got real consequences, doesn't it, for organisations?
It sure does. And I mean, I don't want to compare Australia and Canada. The massive difference between Australia and Canada is the Canadian education ownership is owned at the provincial level, whereas it's in Australia we still have a national Department of Education. So it's probably a little bit easier from that perspective. The way that the Canadian caps were pushed out was that each province would then articulate amongst its own provincial members as to how they would roll out province by province by province. While BC might have a certain look and feel to it, Ontario has a very different look and feel. So from engaging with that from overseas, that makes it an even more complex kind of arrangement. Whereas I think at least with Australia, it's probably a little bit more top down and consistent across all the states and territories.
Effective content in international education is about consistency, quality, and clarity. It tells a story that connects in a format that works with your channels. Talk to the team at Insider, an award-winning creative agency focused on international education. Visit insiderstudios.com.au for more.
Let's maybe now flip the coin over. We have obviously been talking a lot about the inbound student side of things, but the flip side is always outbound, learning abroad. And Australia, for the longest time, has really outperformed most of our comparable peers around the world in terms of the number of students from Australia going and having international learning experiences abroad. And we've got a few things that have come out in this space recently. Do you want to kick us off there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, to kick it off, the Teachers Program, which we talk about and we obviously promote, rave about, we're big supporters of, have just had UNE rejoin, which is fantastic. So, I mean, again, I think Liam was saying they're almost back to full complement prior to COVID, which is really, really good to hear. UNE, obviously, I guess a smaller regional institution in the Northern Tablelands, New South Wales, but wonderful to see that they're prioritising, their outbound mobility program again, and being able to join a Teachers is a really good step in that direction. So congratulations to UNE and a Teachers on that.
I'm looking forward to catching up with Liam Prince tomorrow at UWA. He's going to come on and share some stories as an individual podcast episode. So keep an eye out for that one in the months ahead. So I'm really looking forward to catching up with him because the guy tells a really good yarn.
He's a great guy, isn't he? So
yeah.
I'm envious.
Yeah, I know. It's such a privilege to actually sit down and have an hour to chew into some of the backstories of some of these people that we know really well from around the industry, including you, Mr. Mulder. We had the opportunity at AIEC to sit down, and that episode's coming up too. So I think you tell a really good yarn too, mate. I'm looking forward to...
We'll see.
But, shocking some people with some of the stories. You got some great yarns. That was a cracking conversation.
Yeah, good.
And sorry, just one last comment on a Chichis. Of course, there's the new Colombo Plan, the Australian government's international program to help Australian students have experiences in the Indo-Pacific region. The sort of premier experience is the scholarship program, students spending up to 19 months in the Indo-Pacific, and then a much broader mobility program helping students to have shorter term experiences around the place. But there's been a shift in focus for the new Colombo Plan, and maybe not a shift in focus, but a deepening focus on language acquisition. And Chichis is obviously one of the premier organisations, probably the premier organisation committed to helping students have language acquisition. And that's, of course, around Indonesian language. So our nearest neighbour, and we need more of our students and human beings in this country speaking Indonesian. So it's really good news, I think, with that increasing focus on language acquisition in the NCP. Hopefully that's going to drive more students to pick up Indonesian, and hopefully that's a good thing for Chichis and that consortium.
For sure.
The other thing that's come out is CIS's regular learning abroad survey, now into its 7th edition. Brad Doherty, the principal over there at CIS, so good to have these really smart, experienced operators in our industry doing this key pieces of industry research that help us understand what's going on at the coalface. Should we dive into that a little bit?
Sounds good.
I'll kick us off here. The big headline numbers, if you like, pre-COVID, Australian universities were sending about 55,000 of our local students on international learning abroad experiences. Of course, COVID shut that down to essentially zero. And now we're seeing the chart sort of starting to tick back up. And Kerry Ramirez and Study Move have also done the learning abroad benchmark for the AIEC. So we're seeing those numbers starting to come back up, and we're back up to about 31,000. So still well short of the 55,000 students that were having international experiences in 2019. What's interesting in the CIS work is that rebound, if you like, is expected to continue, but still fairly modest. I think they're looking at having 34, institutions predicting about 34,000 students to have international learning abroad experiences next year. So it's a slow recovery, Dirk. Any thoughts on that?
It is, Rob. Yeah, look, I mean, the dot point that really sticks out in my mind is how uneven that growth is too.
Yeah, definitely.
So, again, I'm just looking at on my screen here where we've got some of these dot points in a run sheet, but an increase of 20% enrolments is expected in 2025, primarily driven by 11 universities, representing 75% of the sector growth. So 11 universities, 75% of the sector growth. It's that unevenness that I think across the sector, and if you're in the AUIDF or in learning abroad forums, that's probably where you want to be looking at in identifying if you sit outside of those 11, how do you pick up your game? How do you motivate those students?
Yeah, and it's not, I mean, there's definitely a shift in student attitudes, but I think so much of this just comes back to resourcing. And once again, talk about an unexpected consequence of international student caps. Well, of course, if an institution is having to tighten its belt and it's looking across its international operations, learning abroad is not a revenue-generating area of international. And so, it's pretty hard for institutions to then commit the resources to do that well. And this is Australia's engagement. This is our Erasmus program sort of thing. And for those who don't know Erasmus, it's the Europe-wide exchange program. This is Australia's engagement with the rest of the world. And that gets whittled away as an unintended consequence of capping international student numbers, because institutions don't have the revenue to continue to invest in more staffing on their learning abroad side of things. So once again, kind of short-sighted. We've just mentioned the new Colombo Plan and engagement with countries around the region and around the world for that matter. One of the key stats that jumped out at me from CIS's work is the fact that 92%, so study tours are by far the dominant type of experience of interest for students. 92% of students are interested in doing a study tour. That to me is really interesting because at the same time, there have been these changes to the new Colombo Plan where there's been an increasing priority on longer term experiences, particularly the scholarship program, where the numbers are expected to at least double, if not probably double in terms of the number of students receiving the 19-month experience. And Dirk, maybe the other thing we should mention is that there's been a shift in the NCP where in the past students could have a 2-week experience, and now that's been pushed out to 4 weeks, and that's going to have some consequences, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the major kind of prevailing thoughts across the sector at the moment is that will certainly favour probably more the group of 8 institutions where students are probably a little bit more or aren't as reliant on self-income as opposed to some of the other institutions. So being able to, say, leave a job for 4 weeks or 6 weeks or longer and then being able to return to it, or some of the activities that you might have or responsibilities that you might have on a daily basis will certainly will be, I don't want to use the word inequitable, but there will be an inequitability about that.
Yeah, definitely a disparity. Look, there's so much good stuff in this report from CIS. I believe you've put some of these figures up online already as well. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. That's right, yeah. So published a story yesterday on CIS on basically the whole program, and there's also a link there to be able to download the full report.
I'd really encourage people to jump in there and have a look at this. This is the kind of work, if you really want to get a quick sense of the other side of the coin, if that's not your side of international, this kind of work really just kind of summarises where Australian institutions, universities are up to with their learning abroad. So I'd suggest jumping in there and having a look at this report, because there's some really, really good stuff in there. And maybe my closing comment on this one, Dirk, was just also reflecting on the new Colombo Plan once again. There's a new external advisory group being chaired by Assistant Minister Tim Watts. Some really good names on that. We've talked about that previously on the podcast, but last week there was a consultation that just closed where there was a call for submissions from around the industry, and I know a number of people, or quite a lot of people, have put in their submissions about the future of the new Colombo Plan, and I'm aware that that group will be meeting in the coming weeks to sort of go through those submissions. So watch this space. It's really great to see a new reference group, new advisory group being formed for the new Colombo Plan. I was involved in the new Colombo Plan for 6 or 7 years on the original reference group, and that really had a really positive impact, I think, on the direction of the program. The voice of the coalface was very clearly heard and had good input. So watch that space for what's going to happen in terms of that advisory group in the weeks ahead.
Absolutely. And just a sidebar, Rob, I was tickled pink yesterday. The Assistant Minister showed up on my LinkedIn follower feed. He's followed the Koala himself, so it's good to see. Good to see the Assistant Minister. And if you're listening, a shout out to you.
Shout out to the Assistant Minister. That's kind of cool. Yeah, wow. Congratulations, mate. That means you're getting some serious traction.
Yeah, no, it is. It's good. It's good. It's great, actually. Like I said, I was pretty chuffed. So shall we move on?
Let's move on.
2 major points to cover before we finish up. First one, there's been a couple of agent training announcements. So firstly, ICEF and Edified have joined forces to create an agent training program that will be, I guess, global in nature. But again, 2 very credible organisations operating in that space. Watch this as it rolls out, because I think this is going to be a really big one in terms of they're doing that through the ICEF Academy. So that'll be great. And the second is between AIEC, which is obviously the Indian Agent Association, and Open Learning. Obviously, this will be a lot more focused on South Asia. Don't need to be an AIEC member to join that, but certainly, again, it's just great to see, in my view, the sector lifting standards in its own way, and self-lifting standards, as opposed to waiting for government to dong it on its head to make it happen. So congratulations to ICEF, Edified, AIEC, and Open Learning for making strides in this space.
Nice. Anything else that sort of popped up over the last couple of weeks that caught your attention?
Mate, the big one, it's funny, like I obviously follow a lot of feeds of a lot of institutions and whatnot, and Griffith seem to have been really hitting a couple of home runs just this last couple of weeks. Firstly, they opened a new Pathways home in Brisbane, so it's on Ann Street. So from memory, Griffith College, which is obviously operated by Navitas as a partner, and the English Language Institute will move into that space. It just looked like a fabulous facility, and bringing all of those things together, I think, is a really, really good thing. So congratulations to Griffith on that one. But to finish on a really good news story, the Industry Mentor Program at Griffith University celebrates 30 years this week. Again, we are taping on Wednesday the 6th, and tonight there's a celebration at the Brisbane campus for that program, and they held one earlier in the week at the Gold Coast. What an amazing, I saw it, and one of the things that came out of AIEC for the Koala was, is there a chance to focus more on good news stories? Because it's obviously been pretty rough going over the last number of months with legislation and changes in that space. So I'm consciously squirreling away now for good news stories, and this fits the bill so well. 7,000 mentees have gone through the program, and 1,100 mentors. Amazing outcomes. So basically, open to domestic and international students up until 12 months post-graduation or post-completing your program. So it's really about facilitating your graduate journey into the workforce. And a lot of the mentees come back to be mentors. So it just ticks so many boxes. When we talk about things like, for a broader sense, work integrated learning, we talk about mentoring programs, we talk about, upskilling into the workforce, we talk about career development. This just seems to kind of nail the bullseye on a lot of that stuff. And for it to be going for 30 years, no doubt it would have started off, testing the waters and kind of having its own way. But it seems like it is just really bedded down what needs to happen in this space for most institutions. So a massive congratulations to the guys at Griffith there. And couldn't be more prouder of an institution in Australia leading the way in this space.
That's us, I think, mate. It's that lovely time on campus now as students start to drift away into exams, and then we sort of start, that roll down towards Christmas. Of course, there's a lot of big stuff coming up. The legislation potentially in front of Parliament in a couple of weeks' time. We'll be watching out for that. And, of course, as you've already mentioned, US presidential election unfolding as we speak. Just as you were chatting, I was jumping on to see if there's an early indication, and everything is still saying too close to call.
Yes.
So fortunately, we're not going to run ourselves into a wall by making some sort of prediction in this podcast.
It's funny. Before we got on, I did log on to CNN, and I think they just called Kentucky for Trump and Vermont for Harris, and I looked at their numbers, and it was like 8 electoral college votes to Trump and 3 to Harris. So we've got a long way to go.
A long way to go.
It'll be interesting to see.
I'm looking at it live, 71 for Harris, 101 for Trump. But in the swing states, North Carolina's trending Trump, Pennsylvania's and Michigan both trending Harris. So, by the time this is out, I tell you what, I know it's been a bumpy year for Australian international educators, but there you've got an entire country, one of the most significant in the world, that's in an even bumpier situation. So, let's be grateful that the problems that we face are still, in global context, relatively limited.
Absolutely.
Great to see you, mate. And I look forward to being back on the East Coast by the next time we talk. And for those listening at home, have yourself an awesome couple of weeks. Great to see you again, Dirk.
Thanks, Rob. Take care.
The Global Horizons podcast is brought to you by the Global Society, Australia's learning abroad support company. For about 10 years, the Global Society has been supporting Australian learning abroad teams with technology, training, consulting, strategy, marketing, you name it. We all know that learning abroad is time-consuming and complex, so if your team could use a little bit of extra support, reach out to the Global Society, globalsociety.com.au.
Today's episode was recorded on Garigal land in Sydney, and we pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. Thank you. See you next time.